Last time we spoke about the Allied invasion of Balikpapan. In June of 1945, the war in the Pacific escalated as American forces, spearheaded by Generals Eichelberger and Kruger, fiercely battled the entrenched Japanese on Luzon. Despite harsh conditions and fierce resistance, the Americans made crucial advances, capturing key positions that rekindled hope for the Filipino people. Concurrently, preparations for the invasion of Balikpapan intensified. The Australian 7th Division assembled for a July 1st amphibious assault against a heavily fortified Japanese defense, known for its formidable coastal artillery and entrenched positions. The Australians faced fierce opposition upon landing, however, skilled maneuvering and robust artillery support allowed them to swiftly gain a foothold. As the Australians secured their beachhead, they marked the beginning of a challenging campaign against a determined Japanese force in Balikpapan, setting the stage for further confrontations in the Pacific theater. This episode is Victory at Bougainville. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a rather silly episode looking at how Japanese anime portrays the Pacific War. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/pacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. We last left off on Bougainville by mid-April. Brigadier Heathcote Hammer's 15th Brigade had just commenced its crucial task of relieving Brigadier Field's weary and battered 7th Brigade. This transition came at a pivotal moment when Brigadier Stevenson's 11th Brigade successfully secured the Sorokin Peninsula, a strategic point on Bougainville's southern coast, while also continuing their efforts to contain enemy forces along the notorious Numa Numa Trail, a crucial supply route for Japanese troops. Supported by reinforcements in artillery and air power, Generals Savage and Bridgeford were optimistic about continuing their limited offensive towards the south. Their immediate objective was to capture the line of Hungarai River, considered a significant tactical advantage, followed by the Hari River, which would serve as the 15th Brigade's main aim. On the opposing side, General Kanda had learned a harsh lesson about the ineffectiveness of banzai charges during the fierce fighting at the Battle of Slater's Knoll. This costly experience prompted him to alter his strategy significantly. He decided to pull his remaining troops back to a defensive perimeter focused around Buin, which is located on the southern region of Bougainville. Here he reinforced the defenses with garrison troops from Kedah, situated on the eastern side of Bougainville, the Shortland Islands to the northwest, and the Faroes Islands to the northeast. However, with this concentration of forces not expected to be operational until July, the troops stationed in the forward areas were tasked with executing a critical delaying action in the meantime, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Meanwhile, on April the 17th, the Australian 24th Battalion began its advance along the Buin Road, a vital route for both supply and troop movements. Two companies made their way towards Dowie's Creek, while another company launched an assault against the enemy strongholds at Kindata. Remarkably, they broke through the enemy lines the following day, pushing further to Sindow Creek and Umam Creek. Here they faced multiple sharp counterattacks over the next week, demonstrating the fierce resistance from Japanese forces determined to hold their ground. As patrols moved deeper into the thick jungle on either side of the Buin Road, the struggle became increasingly intense. Each advance was hard-fought, marked by skirmishes that tested the resolve and endurance of the Australian soldiers. Finally, on April the 26th, the advance resumed in earnest, making rapid gains towards Hungarai River. The combination of heavy air support and relentless artillery bombardment had effectively dispelled any opposition along the route, allowing the Australians to push forward with renewed vigor. By May the 4th, as the 24th Battalion finally approached the banks of the Hungarai River, they encountered significant resistance. However, on the 4th, Lieutenant Lawn's platoon was advancing with 2 tanks and a bulldozer when the crew of a leading tank came to a log across the road and saw movement in a bush. A burst of machine gun fire from the tank cut the leaves away and revealed the barrel of a field gun. The first round fired from the tank's 2-pounder disabled the enemy gun, and the enemy seemed to flee. Farther ahead, however, a mine exploded at the rear of the second tank. It was discovered that it had been exploded with a wire by a Japanese concealed in a bush. Henceforward, mines and concealed guns were encountered more and more frequently. They were detected chiefly by the practice eyes of engineer teams, led by Major Needhams, who was leading the 15th Field Company, who became increasingly skillful at his job. Mechanical detectors were defeated by several sorts of mines employing wooden boxes filled with TNT, for example, but their presence was betrayed by their protruding fuses, wires, disturbed earth, and confirmed by prodding with the bayonet. As the 24th Battalion neared the Hungarai, it became evident that the Japanese intended to make the Australians pay a price for each advance. They were willing to trade a field gun for a tank at every opportunity. On the 4th and many later occasions, leading tanks were fired on at a range of just a few yards by guns cleverly concealed both sides of the track, but in positions from which the Japanese could not hope to extricate them. In other respects, also the Japanese tactics were improving and their striking power was strengthened. Each forward Australian battalion was now under frequent artillery fire, evidently directed by Japanese observers who remained close to the Australian advance, and this was causing quite a lot of casualties. The shells usually burst in the trees and their fragments were scattered over a wide area with lethal effect. To counter the tanks, the Japanese were now establishing their positions not astride the track, but about 100 yards from in its place, where the tanks could not reach, and then until a sidetrack had to be made. Now, the Hungarai River is a critical geographical landmark, and it runs through Bougainville's lush terrain, acting as both a natural barrier and a tactical objective. In late April, the 9th Battalion had continued to push forward across the Hio River, a vital waterway that intersected with the Japanese defenses. They faced some enemy resistance, but managed to clear the Rumaki Trail by the end of the month. This narrow, winding path had strategic importance, connecting various units and enabling supplies to move closer to the front lines. On May the 3rd, the 9th Battalion was finally relieved by the 57th 60th Battalion, which, due to its relative inexperience, found progress challenging along the Commando Road, a route named after the elite Australian commandos who often operate in the area. Their inexperience in facing seasoned Japanese troops led to slower advances in the crucial days that followed. Meanwhile, the 208th Commando Squadron had been conducting deep reconnaissance patrols towards the Hungarai River and along the Tiger Road, determined to discover the extent of the Japanese defenses south of the Hungarai. The Tiger Road, notorious for its rugged conditions, was pivotal for troop movements in the region. On May the 5th, the 24th Battalion, now bolstered by a newly assigned tank squadron, resumed its advance with renewed determination. However, they were once again halted by fierce defenders who launched strong yet costly counterattacks. This desperate but valiant effort by the Japanese troops resulted in significant casualties and demonstrated their resolve to maintain control of the Hungarai line. Subsequently, the Japanese forces ultimately abandoned their positions along the Hungarai during the night. And finally, on May the 7th, the Australians reached the Hungarai River, marking a significant milestone in their campaign. At that moment, the 57th 60th Battalion was securing a crucial crossing over the Hungarai on the Commando Road, enabling further advances into enemy territory. With the next objective focused on the line stretching from the Hungarai River to Monotu and Kapana, Brigadier Hammer's battalions shifted their tactics for the 2nd and 3rd weeks of May. They undertook deep patrols in a Japanese-occupied territory, gathering vital intelligence while also seeking to harass the enemy and disrupt their operations. Additionally, the commandos maintained their patrols along the challenging Tiger Road and established a new patrol base further north of Monterey. This base would serve as a critical outpost for monitoring enemy movements and launching further operations. Meanwhile, the 58th and 59th Battalion explored the rugged areas south of the Bouin Road, successfully clearing the Aitara mission. This mission played a crucial role in the broader strategies as it prepared them to execute a wide flanking maneuver aimed at cutting the road east of Hungarai, further encircling the Japanese forces. Now, to support the advancing Australian forces, New Zealand aircraft launched significant attacks on Japanese concentrations positioned along the Bouin Commando roads. On May the 17th, the 57th 60th Battalion crossed the upper reaches of the Hungarai River, advancing across a wide front along the Commando Road to draw the enemy's attention to that area. On the eve of this move, Hammer issued an order of the day in a characteristic style. He spoke of his undying admiration for and extreme confidence in his men, and he told them that the next few weeks might see the major defeat of the Japanese in southern Bougainville. "Go to battle as you have done in the last month, and no enemy can withstand you." In the subsequent days, they successfully secured territory up to the Inttroduction River, creating a pressure on the Japanese lines and disrupting their defensive operations. On May the 20th, following a powerful air and artillery bombardment, the 24th Battalion finally launched its long-anticipated assault across the Hungarai River. This marked a turning point as they occupied the strategically significant Egan's Ridge by May the 22nd. Egan's Ridge offered an elevated position that overlooked the surrounding terrain, making it crucial for controlling movements in the vicinity. Meanwhile, the 58th and 59th Battalion executed a stealthy wide flanking maneuver towards Mayberry's Crossing, positioning themselves strategically to disrupt Japanese supply lines communication. On May the 21st, the Australians moved out once more to cut the Buin Road at Runai, an essential route that facilitated the movement of supplies for the Japanese. In the following days, the remaining sections of this critical road were secured as the Japanese forces west of the Hadi River were forced to retreat, effectively diminishing their operational capabilities in the region. As these operations unfolded, the 208th Commando Squadron established a new base at Morikamaru, positioning themselves for further reconnaissance and engagements. They began patrolling towards Tai and the Minefield River, both vital points of interest as the Australians sought to gather intelligence on the enemy. In the meantime, the 57th 60th Battalion pressed on to capture the Oso Junction by May the 27th. However, they encountered harassment from night raiding parties and artillery fire, which highlighted the persistent threat of Japanese resistance in the area. On June the 2nd, the main advance was resumed. The 58th 59th moved forward without opposition through positions which had been completely devastated by air, artillery, and mortars. Not one enemy was found alive or dead, although a strong smell of death pervaded the whole area. A prisoner was later taken that day, and he said that the airstrike had completely demoralized the defenders. When they heard the tanks approaching, they just fled. On the left, the 57th and 60th reached the Sunin River against slight opposition. On the 3rd and 4th, the 58th 59th continued their advance, moving slowly because of the need to disarm the unprecedentedly large number of mines and booby traps, more than 103 days until they reached the Pepero River. Patrols moving stealthily forward to the Hade and across it found evidence of much confusion, many positions dug but unoccupied, and small groups of Japanese at large. It was decided to attack frontally towards the Hade the next day. At the same time, the 57th 60th Battalion also reached the Sunin River, facing just slight opposition during their advance. On June the 6th, the 58th 59th Battalion launched an attack towards the Hadi River, but despite their efforts, they only managed to gain about 500 yards against strong defensive positions. The next 3 days proved quite challenging as the 58th 59th Battalion, supported by tanks, found their progress impeded by swampy terrain, a road littered with hidden mines, and intermittent shell fire threatening their advance. The combined obstacles of the natural environment and determined enemy resistance severely limited their ability to make significant gains. In light of the pressing circumstances, Brigadier Hammer made a pivotal decision to send the 58th 59th Battalion on a shallow outflanking march to the north. Their mission was clear: cut the Buin Road several miles east of the Hadi River. At the same time, the 57th 60th Battalion was tasked with thrusting wide to the south, maneuvering around the Overcame River to intercept the same road near Rusai. After about 4 days of concentrated aerial and artillery bombardment designed to weaken the enemy defenses, the 58th 59th Battalion commenced its operation on June the 12th. They sent 2 companies forward to secure a position along the road, located 2,000 yards east of the Hadi. This forward position was crucial for their strategy to disrupt Japanese supply lines. 2 days later, on June the 14th, these forces continued their advance eastwards towards the Overcame River, while the remainder of the battalion engaged the enemy on the Hadi Ford. Despite some fierce opposition, the ford was finally secured on June the 15th, following another extensive bombardment that significantly diminished the Japanese presence along the road west of Ogarata. This success was instrumental in facilitating further operations. Concurrently, the 57th 60th Battalion had embarked on their mission on June the 11th, making slow but steady progress through challenging and trackless bush. They ultimately found a path leading from Kingori to Rusai, where they began encountering Japanese resistance. Pushing through treacherous swampy terrain and dense bamboo thickets, the Australians reached the Buin Road at Rusai by June the 15th, successfully coordinating with patrols from the 58th 59th Battalion the following day. In addition to securing Rusai, a robust patrol from the 57th 60th Battalion set out along the northern flank to establish a patrol base north of Musaraka. This base detected a significant enemy presence behind them, leading to a critical reassessment of their positions. Consequently, in late June, the 24th Battalion was dispatched to take over the Tai Kingori Katsua area, reinforcing the Australian foothold and securing vital routes in the region. Meanwhile, back to the south, the 57th 60th Battalion began to push eastwards towards the Hungarai River on June the 16th. However, their advance quickly met strong opposition about 400 yards into the enemy territory. Faced with determined resistance, the battalion executed a wide outflanking maneuver, a tactical shift that successfully forced the Japanese forces to withdraw by June the 19th. In the following days, the 57th 60th Battalion pressed steadily forward, ultimately encountering increased opposition near the Hungarai River on June the 24th. A heavy bombardment was launched in an attempt to dislodge the entrenched Japanese forces, but it proved ineffective. However, the next day, the Japanese troops had mysteriously withdrawn, allowing the Australians to secure a vital crossing over the river. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the 58th 59th Battalion moved in to occupy the newly attained mobile positions. Meanwhile, the 57th, 60th, and 24th Battalions advanced farther north, preparing for an outflanking maneuver aimed at Shishigatero, a critical tactical point lying to the northeast. In anticipation of an Australian offensive, General Kanda dispatched the 23rd Regiment to establish a defensive base near the Mivo Ford. This strategic relocation was part of his preparations for a final defense behind the Mivo River, as the Japanese were seeking to hold their ground against the advancing Australians. By June the 28th, the 57th, 60th, and the 24th Battalions reached their designated assembly areas, where they successfully repelled several Japanese counterattacks. The next morning, they began their advance southeast, shrouded in the loud thunder of artillery barrages that paved the way for their push. They reached the Buin Road at the conflux of Ivana, Kopani, and Mivo rivers. At the same time, the 58th 59th Battalion aimed to open the road for the 24th Battalion, positioned just 1,000 yards away. However, they encountered sharp resistance from Japanese forces defending the positions. Following this notable success, as Hammer's units faced and repelled various Japanese counterattacks at their new positions, General Bridgeford directed Brigadier Noel Simpson's 29th Brigade to the front lines to relieve the beleaguered 15th Brigade. Each incoming battalion was met with sharp clashes as they mopped up, as Japanese forces sought to maintain their hold on such strategic territory. Finally, on July the 10th, Hammer's units were relieved, a long-awaited reprieve after weeks of grueling combat. Despite the shift in command, Simpson's battalions began sending patrols forward in preparation for a crossing of the Mivo River. Unfortunately, due to heavy resistance encountered and the onset of relentless rains that would continue throughout the month, this final offensive was never carried out. Instead, the troops were limited to vigorous patrolling during July and August, maintaining a presence but unable to launch significant offensives in the harsh conditions. Now, many of these patrols encountered fierce opposition, signaling that the enemy intended to mount a determined defense along the Mivo line. These patrols regularly captured crucial documents from Japanese soldiers ambushed along the tracks leading to their forward positions, allowing the Australian forces to conduct a clearer picture of the enemy's intentions and deployments. Among these daring reconnaissance missions was one conducted by a patrol from the 42nd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Oldfield. Tasked with scouting a potential crossing at Mivo, Oldfield and 4 other soldiers discovered that the river was in a flood. Undeterred, they stripped off their gear and swam across the turbulent waters and advanced 500 yards beyond the riverbank without any weapons. The weight of the Australian artillery and mortar bombardments altered the enemy's tactics. Rather than holding fixed positions, the Japanese began to dig in less and instead employed a strategy of hit-and-run raids and ambushes executed by small groups of 3 to 10 men. Before July the 10th arrived, the relentless rain compelled a second postponement of the advance. The new date for the operation was now set for July the 24th. However, the downpour continued to intensify. By July the 10th, even the patrols could not cross the flooded Mivo. Torrential rain flooded the divisional area, reducing the Buin Road to a treacherous sea of mud, creating a series of islands between the various rivers. On July the 17th, conditions worsened further, with a dramatic 8 inches of rain falling in just 36 hours. The new challenge was no longer about advancing troops, but ensuring that the men were fed and they remained. Virtually all the bridges along the lines of communication were just washed away, and all the rivers were flooded. The Mivo was now surging at a speed of about 12 miles an hour. As a result, the forward units could only be supplied via air transport. It would take weeks to repair the damaged roads and bridges, leading to D-Day being postponed until late August. As the southern operations unfolded, General Savage made a strategic decision to bring Brigadier Arnold Pott's 23rd Brigade from Munda and its surrounding islands to Torikina. Upon arrival, Savage immediately tasked the 27th Battalion with taking over the central sector beyond Pearl Ridge. The Australians quickly began bombing and launching attacks in the Berry Hills Hunts area, as the 27th Battalion conducted patrols towards key positions at Sisivi, Tokua, Base Point 3, and Warney's Hill throughout late May. On June the 3rd, they initiated an attack towards Tiernan Spur, making significant progress before being relieved by the 7th Battalion. The 7th Battalion, upon taking over, adopted an aggressive posture, and on June the 11th, they attacked Tiernan Spur, successfully securing the feature this time. Soon thereafter, a combination of reconnaissance and air bombardment set the stage for an assault on Werney's Hill on June the 16th. However, they encountered strong opposition and they were unable to seize its crest until June the 20th. In parallel operations, a company captured CCV without encountering resistance on June the 12th. Another company was dispatched to establish a forward base at the Hungarai Valley, successfully creating observation posts that overlooked the Innes Point and the rather large Numa Plantation by June the 21st. After conducting extensive bombardments against remaining Japanese positions, the Australians finally secured the remainder of Werney's Hill on June the 24th. Starting on June the 26th, the 7th Battalion began probing towards Center Hill, which they ultimately found abandoned by July the 6th. Meanwhile, on July the 3rd, Tokyo was occupied as a base for future operations, probing north towards Ibu and Buritsio Tarara. Artillery and aircraft continued to harass North Hill, which was finally captured on June the 13th. Just 5 days later, Cameron's Hill was successfully attacked and secured. The 7th Battalion then pressed forward along the main track towards Charlie Creek and McInnes Hill, achieving their objectives by August the 8th, as the remaining Japanese forces were forced to retire to Numa. Looking a bit north, the 55th and 53rd Battalion took over from the exhausted 26th Battalion in early April, following the fall of the Sorokhan Peninsula. Upon assuming command, Lieutenant Colonel Stevenson immediately directed the 55th 53rd to cross the Nagam River and launched an attack towards Porapora. The battalion pressed on along the main coastal track, but on April the 13th they faced an unsuccessful assault against the enemy positions at McKinnon's Ridge. Meanwhile, a company from the battalion moved through the inland route, encountering no resistance as they advanced to a position just 2 miles from Porapora, recognizing the resolute enemy defenses along the main track. The Australians initiated a program of heavy artillery bombardment, complemented by flanking maneuvers designed to outmaneuver the entrenched defenders. This relentless strategy began to pay off, eventually forcing the Japanese to retreat on April the 21st. During this critical period, the unopposed company on the inland track continued to push forward until it was only 1 mile from Porapora. In the following 4 days, the 55th 53rd Battalion fought its way into the Porapora bottleneck, engaged in fierce combat that successfully expelled the Japanese forces by April the 30th. With this victory, the Australians were able to continue their advance northward, marking rapid gains against the retreating enemy. On May the 4th, they captured the Rotsua Jetty, a vital logistics point that facilitated further operations. 2 columns of the 55th 53rd commenced a swift march towards Ruri Bay, with a company of the 26th Battalion successfully seizing Torokori Island on May the 6th. 3 days later, they finally approached Ruri Bay. The Australians then successfully repelled an enemy ambush. However, Brigadier Stevenson's orders were now to halt their advance at the Ruri Bay line and focus on active patrolling extending northward to Tarbut and Tarlina. Despite this directive, the situation became increasingly precarious. The Japanese, bolstered by 4 small provisional battalions of naval troops under Captain Keito Ikichi, grew aggressive beyond the established line. Daily patrol clashes erupted, with Australian positions and supply lines subjected to constant ambushing. Recognizing the need for reinforcements, the weary 55th 53rd Battalion was now relieved by the 26th Battalion on May the 21st. In response, the 26th immediately dispatched 2 companies to thrust forward in the area south and east of the Boy Plantation. However, these units quickly encountered strong counterattacks, while patrols faced heavy resistance around Seara and Chindawan. As Stevenson's forces found themselves facing a fortified opponent stronger than anticipated, permission was granted to send 2 companies from the 31st 51st Battalion to take over the western sector on June the 3rd. Despite the reinforcements, the Australians continued to struggle to make meaningful progress. After the 26th Battalion had been in line for 3 hard weeks, its diarist wrote that the campaign had become, quote, holding a superior number of enemy by the aggressive action of a tired, depleted battalion's companies with no more than half strength, and had been in forward areas continuously for 4 months. The battalion's fighting strength on June the 3rd was only 23 officers and 353 men. The constant patrolling, the artillery fire, and the raids on jeep trains on tracks well to the rear were wearing down the men's spirits. In response to the persistent challenges, a strategic decision was made to outmaneuver the Japanese by landing a reinforced company of the 31st 51st Battalion at Porton Plantation, aiming to approach the enemy from the western flank. During the early hours of June the 8th, the assault force successfully landed unopposed and established a perimeter, reaching about 150 yards inland. However, the surprised defenders quickly regrouped and unleashed a barrage of machine gun fire that effectively thwarted the unloading of heavy weapons, reserve ammunition, and essential supplies. Although supporting artillery fire was effectively directed at the Japanese positions, the Australians soon found themselves pinned down as Captain Kato reinforced the defenses surrounding the perimeter. To complicate matters further, a convoy of Australian supplies and reinforcements attempted to reach the newly established perimeter, which was successfully repelled by tenacious defenders during the night. The next morning, it was decided to withdraw the force late that evening. However, as the Australians prepared for their retreat, the Japanese launched a strong counterattack from three sides. The enemy attacked in relentless waves, and although they were met with devastating Australian fire, the pressure forced the company to pull back towards the beach. Now estimated at over 400, they attacked in waves, and they were mowed down by Australian fire. To confuse their enemy, they shouted English phrases such as, "Watch to the right flank," "Throw it in the middle," "It's only me, Jack," and so on. The Australians pulled back towards the beach by 1 p.m. During the afternoon, 3 landing craft moved towards the beach under heavy enemy fire in an effort to embark the soldiers. Unfortunately, 2 of the crafts were overloaded and they became stranded. One eventually drifted off with the tide during the evening. However, the other remained besieged by heavy fire throughout the night. On June 10th, Australian forces continued their attempts to rescue the stranded men, launching efforts under the cover of a strong air attack. At dawn on June the 10th, there were 38 living men on board the besieged landing craft, commanded by Corporal Hall. Their meager arsenal included 2 Bren guns, 5 and some machine guns, and 9 rifles. The remaining rations consisted of about 8 tins of fruit or vegetables, 3 or 4 tins of meat, and 3 tins of condensed milk. Corporal Hall devised a defensive plan to maximize their chances of survival. He removed the wooden shelves under the overlapping sides of the LACA to create a protective cover under the flaps for all the troops. The dismantled wireless set was discarded overboard to free up additional space. To assist with the breathing during rising tides, each man was issued 6 inches lengths of copper piping. A continuous watch was kept from the coxswain's enclosure to monitor Japanese movements and report any developments. The soldiers cleaned and oiled their weapons using lubricant sourced from the engines, ensuring that they were well maintained and ready for use. A medical kit was placed in the capable hands of a member of the 19th Australian Field Ambulance, who diligently distributed morphine and dressings as needed. At about 3:30 on June the 10th, a concerted effort to rescue the stranded survivors commenced. An intense and precise air attack targeted the enemy positions, but unfortunately, it failed to hit the pillbox from which most of the fire was directed at the barge. Bombers dropped inflated rubber rafts near the landing craft in an attempt to assist, but Japanese gunfire prevented any men from reaching these lifelines. Under the cover of an artillery smoke screen, a landing craft attempted to reach the shore. However, enemy fire wounded several crew members, including the coxswain, damaging the steering gear and causing the craft to circle out of control. Amidst this chaos, Corporal Hall attempted to silence the pillbox with a Bren gun, but his efforts were all in vain. In a desperate bid to assist the aircraft in locating the target, he splashed bullets towards the pillbox, yet the attempt proved futile, as the damaged landing craft was forced to withdraw. They successfully repelled several Japanese parties attempting to swim out to the immobilized craft during the night. Finally, in the early hours of June the 11th, the besieged Australians were finally rescued by 3 assault boats, managing to pull them from the critical situation. During this endeavor, the Australian forces suffered significant losses, with 23 men reported killed or missing and 106 wounded. Amongst these casualties, 5 were killed and 7 were wounded, belonging to the 42nd Landing Craft Company. Estimates suggest that the Japanese forces faced losses of approximately 147 confirmed dead, with an additional 50 likely dead. The infantry unit suffered specifically dire consequences, with 2 officers killed and 3 wounded. These included both company commanders, leaving only Lieutenants Patterson and Ryder, 2 young veterans from the 6th Division, as the sole surviving leaders from 6 platoon commanders. Additionally, 14 other ranks were reported killed or missing, with 57 wounded. Of those wounded, 5 were sent to the field ambulance suffering from exposure, and 9 sustained cuts and bruises. The repulse of the Australian attempt to land near Porton on June the 8th, 9th, and 10th significantly boosted Japanese morale. Observers reported that the landing occurred on a rough strip of beach, making it difficult for the enemy to negotiate the surrounding reefs. The high ground in the vicinity provided an excellent vantage point for the Japanese, allowing for optimal placement of automatic weapons. In response to the Australian advance, Captain Kato swiftly dispatched 150 troops from Chai Bay to reinforce the approximately 100 men already engaged in combat. These reinforcements succeeded in thwarting any further enemy landings, ultimately pushing the Australians back to the beach, from where the remaining forces were evacuated in haste. Cato estimated that around 250 Australians had landed, resulting in the loss of 60 killed and 100 wounded, alongside 26 Japanese fatalities. If the Japanese report regarding their own losses is accurate, it suggests that both sides engaged in this grim action sustaining approximately equal losses. Moreover, during this battle, the reinforced 26th Battalion failed to exploit this diversionary attack, missing the opportunity to push against the stubborn resistance of Captain Cato's isolated posts. On June the 20th, Brigadier Pott's 23rd Brigade began taking over the northern sector with orders to contain the Japanese forces in the Bonus Peninsula and patrol towards the Buka Passage. This relief operation was completed by the end of the month. However, the 8th and 27th Battalions continued to face harassment from Cato's deep patrols throughout July. Ultimately, the overextended 27th Battalion on the right flank was withdrawn on July the 22nd to allow the 8th Battalion to successfully attack and capture Como Ridge the following day. On July the 24th, the 8th Battalion launched an unsuccessful attack on Part Ridge. However, this heavy assault shook the defenders, paving the way for the Australians to capture the ridge against pretty light opposition on August the 5th. This marked the last major action on Bougainville's campaign. In total, Savaige's 2nd Corps endured losses of about 516 Australians killed and 1,572 wounded. It is estimated that approximately 8,500 Japanese soldiers were killed by Australian forces and their native allies, with an additional 9,800 succumbing to illness during the Australian period on Bougainville. By the end of the campaign, only 23,571 men remained out of the initial 65,000 who had been on the island since the Americans had launched their attacks back in November of 1943. But now we need to turn our attention back to Balikpapan, where General Milford's 7th Australian Division successfully landed on July the 1st. They secured an important perimeter extending through the Sentosa Hill, Parramatta, Mount Malang, and Stalcudo. The battle resumed the following day with the 2 and 14th Battalion advancing along the Vasey Highway to seize Sipungang's airstrip unopposed. Meanwhile, the 2 and 3rd Commando Squadron took over the area northeast of Stalcudo, though they made little progress towards Lady Schofield's feature due to heavy enemy fire. The 2 and 27th Battalion strengthened and extended its hold on some high ground northwest of Stalcudo. The 2 and 16th Battalion pressed northward, successfully capturing Resort, Owen, and Oxley without sustaining any losses. The 2 and 12th Battalion took Potts and consolidated its position on Porty. The 2 and 10th Battalion conducted mopping-up operations in the secured areas, patrolling vigorously forward, and also seized Mount Subulet. Lastly, the 2 and 9th Battalion, supported by a troop of tanks, cleared Canasan's town alongside the coast as far as Signal Hill. By the end of the day, Brigadier Ether's 25th Brigade had landed to take over the central portions of the front, tasked with pushing further inland astride the Milford Highway. On July the 3rd, one company of the 2 and 10th Battalion advanced through the port, while another cleared the tank plateau, and a third focused on the lower ground between the plateau and Parramatta. Concurrently, the 2 and 9th Battalion, supported by its troops of tanks, successfully took the Sentosa barracks, which they bypassed the previous day. The division now held a bridgehead approximately 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep, successfully securing one of the 2 airstrips. On July the 3rd, light aircraft began operating from this newly established base. However, unloading heavy equipment and stores proved to be a challenging task, causing considerable anxiety amongst the troops. A swell made it quite difficult to transfer loading onto the landing craft tanks and smaller craft, while it was possible to run the landing ship tanks directly onto the beach. By 6 a.m. on July the 3rd, progress was evident, with over 985 vehicles and 1,932 tons of various equipment and stores successfully landed, alongside 16,950 men. Later that morning, an LST began unloading a pontoon jetty constructed on Green Beach by an American Naval Construction Battalion. The captured port was a scene of absolute devastation, characterized by wrecked workshops and warehouses, leaving little more than twisted, rusty steel and piles of rubble where the houses once stood. The 7 wharves designed for ocean-going vessels had all been burnt down, rendering them unusable. Amongst the debris, one dump of scrap iron collected by the Japanese from the ruins measured 520 yards long, with another scrap pile opposite of it stretching about 150 yards. As unloading operations continued on the main beaches, the 2 and 14th Battalion began moving towards the Magar airstrip, but found themselves halted at Batakan Kechil. The 2 and 27th Battalion took over the defense of Sipagang's airstrip, and the 2 and 3rd Commando Squadron discovered the Lady Schofield feature was abandoned, allowing their patrols to press on more than a mile across the high ground overlooking the Sipagang River. Meanwhile, the 2 and 33rd Battalion encountered heavy opposition in the hills above the Chilton Road, but managed to capture Opus, operator and oxygen, as well as a height to the northeast named Orange. The 231st Battalion advanced along Milford's Highway, facing increasing opposition, but they rapidly secured the junction with Chilton Road. However, they were unable to capture the strong enemy defenses at Nobody and Nurse. The 212th Battalion began a march towards Pandasari and had to assault Nail to eliminate the threat of enemy harassing fire. The following day, while the 233rd Battalion occupied Letter and Lewis, the 231st found Nobody and Nurse abandoned, allowing them to easily secure them. One company took control of Nail and began probing towards Lodge. At the same time, the 214th Battalion resumed its advance towards Mangar. They successfully crossed the river and pushed 1,300 yards across the airstrip without facing any opposition. However, after midday, heavy Japanese fire unexpectedly swept across the airfield, resulting in the deaths of several officers at the control tower. Despite this setback, and aided by the fire from destroyer Eaton, the Australians pressed on and ultimately secured Mangar and its airfield. By the end of the day, General Milford had successfully pushed the enemy out of Balikpapan and further secured Semagang and Mangar airstrips. However, it did become clear that Admiral Kamada was attempting to withdraw the remnants of his force to the Butachampar area, aiming to delay any advance along the Milford Highway for as long as possible. The 454th Independent Battalion continued to hold the commanding terrain north of Mangar, and on July the 5th, its defenses came under intense naval, air, and artillery bombardment, which initially failed to silence the Japanese guns. Meanwhile, Brigadier Ether pressed his advance north in the center. The 225th Battalion took control of its positions at Nurse and Nail, while the 233rd pressed on against dwindling opposition to capture Mackay, Marshall, Mutual, and Margin. The 231st Battalion moved forward to seize Letter and Lewis, followed by the capture of Laverton and Liverpool. Now, recognizing the necessity of securing the western side of Balikpapan Bay to facilitate port operations, Milford ordered Brigadier Chilton's 18th Brigade to land the reinforced 2 and 9th Battalion at Benjam. Following a naval and artillery bombardment, the landing was executed unopposed during the afternoon of July the 5th, with patrols of the 2 and 9th immediately probing north and south to secure the perimeter. The following day, a patrol moved south towards Nanang Village and onwards to the Susampu River, while other units explored the area towards the Rico River and Sapati. On July the 6th, the 233rd Battalion successfully attacked and captured Metal and Muffle, but they were ultimately repelled from Judge. Meanwhile, the 225th pressed onwards, taking control of Liverpool and occupying Huon. Looking further southeast, the 2 and 14th Battalion began to probe enemy positions on this day. A strong patrol successfully captured Waits Knoll, but had to repel a series of strong counterattacks during the night, while another patrol was forced back along Basie Highway. Over the next few days, the Australians continued to engage, probing and bombarding the commanding enemy positions. Ultimately, the 2 and 14th launched an attack and captured the Frost and Brown Features on July the 9th, effectively eliminating the enemy threat in that area. Meanwhile, the 2 and 16th Battalion and the 2 and 5th Commando Squadron attacked an enemy concentration at Gate on July the 6th and secured the position just 2 days later, further solidifying their hold on Grant by July the 9th. To the northwest, on July the 7th, the 2 and 25th Battalion moved to Colt and then attempted to assault Jam, but was repelled by fierce defenders. The following day, while Jam underwent probing and bombardment, the 2 and 33rd Battalion discovered Justice abandoned after heavy shelling and pressed on towards Joint and Judge. Concurrently, Brigadier Ether had dispatched the 2 and 6th Commando Squadron into the hills overlooking the Somber River. They successfully occupied Job by July the 8th and seized Freight the following day. By July the 9th, after a concentrated artillery barrage, Jame, Joint, and Judge finally fell as the 25th Brigade secured the first stretch of the Milford Highway to Butachampar. The 2 and 31st Battalion then advanced to a road bent towards the north part of Junior, where they encountered an ambush by Japanese raiders. Meanwhile, a company of the 2 and 9th Battalion landed unopposed on Jinabora on the afternoon of July the 8th, and on the following day a patrol base was established at Telok-Tubang. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Today, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/pacificwarchannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. General Hammer launched a fierce campaign across Bougainville, battling entrenched Japanese troops, as they secured the strategic Sorkhan Peninsula and advanced towards the vital Hungarai River. By July, they had reached the Hungarai River, significantly weakening Japanese defenses. However, relentless rain hindered further operations. Yet this campaign highlighted the courageous and enduring nature of the soldiers,